Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Those of you here who are live in the AVA, and also quite a few of you looking in online via Zoom. It's Carl Kirkehead. I'm a professor at the Hospital for Large Animals, but as importantly for today's talk, I'm a faculty fellow at the Center for Animals and Public Policy. And it gives me a distinct pleasure to welcome a colleague and friend, Dr. Parke Wilde. Parke is coming to us today for his talk, which is on the US food policy affecting animal agriculture in a time of climate stress. Before he gets started, just very briefly, Parke did his PhD at Cornell. Can't always be right, but that's okay. He's a food economist and a professor, and he is downtown at the Friedman School of Nutrition Policy. And previously, he worked for the USDA's Economic Research Service. Parke also studies food security and hunger measurement, also the economics of food assistance programs, and federal dietary guidance policy. Parke's director of the USDA-funded RIDGE, Extramural Research Grants Program, and he's also author of an important book entitled Food Policy in the United States, an Introduction, which I would strongly recommend to those of you who want to find out more. Parke, without further ado, it is great to have you here as a fellow Senate member, and please start.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here, and of course, this is just great for us to get each off of our own campus and to visit other campuses within Tufts and to talk about areas of interdisciplinary interest. What I would like to do today is to talk about a couple different topics. One is to connect all of this to the climate crisis that we face, and to talk about my own area of work, which is US food policy, and how that's connected to animal agriculture. And I was basically thinking, what would people in veterinary science who care about environmental issues want to know about sort of the nitty-gritty of agricultural economics and US farm policy? And so that was how I chose the topics for that section. And finally, since we're all at Tufts University, I wanted to spend some time reflecting on how this particular example of intersectional work on a policy topic related to climate is related to things going on at the university as a whole, and what is the potential for Tufts to rise to the occasion of our times and adopt a leadership position in this important sort of syndicate of policy-related issues. And so we'll be talking about broad issues like climate, narrower issues like the food sector, and then as we think about our own campus and university, returning to some broad issues. There's some cross-cutting themes, some sort of characteristics or qualities that show up at different places in the talk, including the importance of the nuts and bolts of carbon accounting, thinking about what is our target for a particular number of degrees change and how much carbon can be emitted in order to be consistent with that. The second is, since you invited an economist, who's not always the most popular person in an intersectional setting, we've got to talk a little about how prices connect to these policies. Third is how innovation is important both in supply and demand. I often get asked on climate issues, why do you focus on that, they say? Why don't you focus on innovation, technological innovation that makes it possible to produce the goods and services that we need in our economy with less carbon? I say, what I'm talking about is in its own way a form of innovation. Innovation can be both on the demand side and on the supply side for each of these important areas of climate policy. Finally, Tufts has us, not quite finally, second to finally, Tufts has an important role in thinking about both the scholarship and the research that we do and public citizenship. This shows up in the TIS College at Tufts, which sort of helps the university identify its own place in thinking about how do we do our research in a way that actually does some good in the world. And finally, the importance of trying it out ourselves. There's a big debate in climate circles about overly personal approaches to addressing the climate crisis, you know, sort of lacking a strategic vision. That is not what this type of trying it out is about. I'm talking about different ways of trying out in our own institution some of the social changes that we think are necessary nationally and internationally, and reflecting on the lessons learned in a way that can inspire larger economic sectors. So here, just this very month, the third working group of the IPCC, the main international research and policy body on climate, is describing how serious is the current situation that we're facing. And if we don't change the way we're organizing our economy and our society, we're going to sail past the carbon budget that's available for any of the safe time paths on climate. And it's more of this orange policy. The area under these curves, as you know, is the carbon budget. So if you think about how much does annual carbon dioxide equivalent emissions need to fall, the real issue is the total amount that gets added to the atmosphere and what is its impact on human-induced climate forcing. And so we need to be on one of these more ambitious paths for a 2-degree change or a 1.5-degree change. And here is from this same third working group that just released its report. The third working group from the IPCC is the one that's most policy-oriented, most social change-oriented. It's not just about what do we fear at night, but about what do we do about it. And this covers broad issues from food to industry, land transport, buildings, electricity, every major sector of the economy. But what I want to do is, at this point, narrow in on the food sector. And so you can see that we're using the food sector as an example for types of changes that need to happen in other sectors as well. And in the food sector, I think about animal agriculture, which is the topic for today. There's a number of supply-side technical innovations. Think, for example, about uses of seaweed that cause beef production to involve lower emissions per unit produced of carbon dioxide equivalents and methane. And also, though, the message from the IPCC is that these supply-side innovations are not enough on their own, and that in each of these major sectors, there needs to be demand-side mitigation also. And this gives an example of how the thinking goes. It's not just about infrastructure, for example, or end-use technology, but it involves also change in sociocultural factors. And so we're thinking about nutrition policy, and we're thinking about cultural change in what is our assumptions as in a society about how central meat has to be consistent with achieving our dietary goals. And this IPCC report does not stand alone. It's typical of a series of high-profile reports. My colleague Will Masters does research on the economics of food costs in connection with the Eat Lancet set of recommendations, which is sort of an interdisciplinary group that was thinking about both the climate science and the nutrition policy for considering model diets that could be adopted in different regions of the world. And again, the idea is to have change in eating patterns internationally that both achieves having enough food and enough nutrition for all of the world's people, including the world's poorest people, but at the same time staying within planetary boundaries. This Eat Lancet report covers many outcomes, cropland use, freshwater use, nitrogen use, but we're focused here on the greenhouse gas emissions, and you can see the role of animal products in total greenhouse gas emissions. And I think for people in this particular setting, it gives us a lot to think about what types of changes are needed, and we have to think realistically about what are the agriculture and food policies that could bring about this type of change without unduly harming people's livelihoods, while still letting all the people in the food system have a satisfactory livelihood. Our own contribution to this line of research, this is with the PhD student Rebecca Boehm a couple years ago. Each of these reports has a table somewhat like this, showing the relative contribution of greenhouse gas emissions from different food categories. I'm just sharing ours. Ours came from input-output modeling, so an economic model that traces back from the final goods and services consumed in the economy to, for each of the stages, iteratively, what goods and services were needed as inputs to them. And you can see that a large part of the climate impact of beef, pork, and other red meat production, for example, comes from the production and manufacturing level stages. It's not just, for example, about the retail marketing or about the transportation. As you think about how could we have social change that involves moderating meat consumption as a proportion of, for example, American diets, we recognize the concern with making sure that everybody has enough nutrients that we need. With meat, with animal agriculture, you think especially of the protein contribution, but you could think also of the iron or a number of other nutrients that are important in meat. And you can see that the issue is more easily addressed to the right of this figure, where in the US or the European Union or Canada or Brazil, people are consuming more protein than they need by dietary estimates of dietary standards. Everything that I say is not to belittle the concern for people in sub-Saharan Africa or Southern Asia, where an important nutrition policy concern is making sure people get enough and even more than they currently have of high-quality protein sources. So let's talk about US food policies that influence animal agriculture. In most settings where I speak, if I say I'm talking about climate, there's a number of stresses. We're worried, for example, I'm reading articles that cause me anxiety late at night about what is the probability of multiple breadbasket failures. You know, you think about the impact of climate on the environment, and it could be a sort of a stressful conversation. If you are worried about food scarcity in a time of climate stress, and you want to be sure that people have enough food, the basic question is, what is the policy implication for price policy, for food price policy? Would you want prices to be higher or prices to be lower? And in most audiences where I speak, and I'm not sure that's going to be the case for this audiences, but in most audiences where I speak, the initial reaction is we need prices to be low enough so that people can afford enough food. You want lower prices if you're concerned about scarcity. And what they have in mind is what economists would call a demand function, which shows how the quantity that people would consume is lower. It's lower to the left of the figure as the price is higher. But if you speak in sectors that are more oriented towards agricultural production, they will catch on that that is not always the correct way to think about it. In some circumstances, if you want more food, what you need to think about is the price being higher. And so I don't know if for people in animal veterinary sciences, whether you're enough oriented towards production that occurs to you. But if you want more food, if you're focused on the supply function, what you want is the price to be higher. And so from an economic policy perspective, the goal is never to just have prices be high or prices be low. You have to focus on what is your wish for the quantities and to have the price policy be suitable. A typical lesson, and you'll have to forgive it since you invited a visiting economist, is that you can't always want prices to be higher or lower. You have to have prices be right. And prices being right means that it sets supply in equilibrium with demand. So prices go up and down. So thinking about price policy is not, for example, a hypothetical thing, nor is it a static thing. We go through, in our global society, periods of time where food prices are comparatively low, and during these times, policymakers may forget about scarcity, right? They may forget that there was ever an oil price crisis in the 1970s that generated high food price inflation. You can go a number of years not worrying about it. And during those years, there may be policy changes and industry changes that allocate more of our productive resources, for example, into biofuels. That's clearly something somebody would only do if they were not particularly worried about food scarcity. Then, at the end of the 1990s and the starts of the, at the end of the 2000s and the starts of the 2010s, there were a series of price spikes that caused riots and concern all around the world, a potential return to trade skeptical national food policies that would restrict exports, for example. All of this is fairly threatening to the international food economy. And then after that, prices come back down for a time, and people forget so quickly that they were worried about scarcity just a couple years earlier. And now, of course, in the news today, we have new concerns generated by the war in Europe of higher than in recent years food price inflation. So thinking about what is the connection between policy and agricultural prices and so forth, I'm going to share a little bit of material from the textbook that Carl mentioned. And at this point, if any of you have heard me speak before, you'll think, oh, he's a one-note speaker. But forgive me for just sort of covering these topics and then moving on to what are the implications for the decision that we face as a university community. So when I talk to lay people about agriculture policy and its effect on things like animal agriculture, there's a couple things I'll most commonly hear. One is that the US has a cheap food policy, that agricultural policy, because it's US agricultural policy is oriented towards industrial agriculture, that we have a cheap food policy. And the second is that we subsidize too much of the unhealthy things and not enough of the healthy things like fruits and vegetables. And you're going to catch on over the next couple minutes to how some of this is, there's some partial truth to some parts of this, but that things, basically, I encourage you not to take all of that with a grain of salt and to focus on how do agriculture policy people think about the several instruments, like I'm going to talk about seven policy instruments that policymakers can use to make food system outcomes come out better than they would happen just under free market conditions. And the first is price supports. Price supports help farmer livelihoods by bumping up the price of products. And for many years, the US had price supports for the major row crops like corn, soybeans, cotton. And price supports, of course, are not a cheap food policy. The whole point is to raise prices and to help farmers better. And I will. Deficiency payments. Deficiency payments are different from price supports. The price supports generated a difficulty where the federal government had to acquire large stocks of commodity in a way that had a lot of pushback. There were a number of reasons why that wasn't necessarily a sustainable policy. Deficiency payments, which have been sort of a leading agricultural policy from about the 70s to about the 90s, has the federal government support farmers by paying farmers for the difference between a market price that's considered too low and a target price that is more supportive of farm incomes. And the idea is the government doesn't buy up the commodity, the government just pays farmers in order to make the total package of revenue coming from both market and government sources sustainable for the farmers. And this is one of the 7 policies that most could be accused of being a cheap food policy. But because of shortcomings of these deficiency payments, including their being expensive, they're causing trouble for our trading partners. So international trade agreements are skeptical of these deficiency payments. And because there's environmental concerns with these deficiency payments, for a number of reasons, the federal government has been experimenting over the last 2 decades, really, with a series of decoupled policy instruments. So decoupled policy instruments are designed to provide support to the agriculture community without affecting prices so much. And so they go through direct payments and counter-cyclical payments. And then currently, most of the emphasis in agriculture policy is on crop insurance. So crop insurance is a large and growing share of the agriculture subsidy bundle, and these deficiency payments and price supports are a smaller section. But the thing that once you realize that there's these several instruments and that they're pushing prices and they're pushing quantities in different directions, you realize that you need to think quantitatively. Once you've caught on that there's not just one thing that farm policy does, but that there's a number, then you have to think quantitatively, and quantitatively it's complicated. Over time, these different policies are used in different proportions. So you can see the different colors represent different of the 7 policies that I just went through, and they're used in different proportions over time. So you can see it makes it difficult to generalize. The last one I want to talk about is demand expansion. If only consumers wanted to buy more food in the first place, and especially, for example, if they want to buy more meat, that's got trickle-down effects through the animal feed sector for the major row crops like grain and soybeans. And if only people wanted to buy more meat, then the price would be higher, which is what farmers want, and the quantity would be higher. So you could see who would be against this. The only people who might be against it is people who have environmental or climate concerns, or people who are concerned about high prices. But from an agriculture sector perspective, demand expansion is very popular. So as an economist, as an agricultural economist by training, in a nutrition school, I find myself focusing more than most folks do on federal policies that are promoting demand expansion. Things like the agricultural commodity checkoff programs for pork and beef, cheese, and the dairy sector. Much more those sectors, it's hundreds of millions of dollars go into promotion of those products, and not nearly so much for fruits and vegetables, for example. And so when people say the wrong things are being subsidized, you can see that they usually mean traditional farm subsidies. And I'm thinking, that's only partly true. But they're not really paying attention to demand expansion. And in the case of demand expansion, I feel like the accusation is accurate, that it really is, there really are federal government efforts to promote demand expansion for food in ways that are not the way a nutrition policy person would design these policies. I could tell a long story about pork, the other white meat. I've got more history on these topics than I can share in this. But besides demand expansion through commodity checkoff programs, the other area of interest for me is demand expansion through making sure that everybody, including low-income people, has enough resources to buy enough food. So recently, for many years, the Thrifty food plan has been a fairly obscure model diet that's used as the cost target for the maximum benefit amount in the SNAP program. It used to be called the food stamp program. And it was just updated for inflation, and each time it had to be updated. Just this past August, the update actually reconsidered more fundamentally what was the amount of food that people needed in a reasonable model diet. And so a fairly obscure bureaucratic decision without needing endorsement from Congress ended up causing a 20% increase in the maximum benefit for the SNAP program. So thinking about these questions that are of interest to you probably about what are the nutrition needs for the animal sector within a healthy and affordable diet ended up being connected to one of the most important safety net policy changes in recent years, at least for nutrition policy. And so the Thrifty food plan has been updated from time to time, but the policy impact has never been as big as it was with this recent Thrifty food plan update in 2021. And so I've got funding from USDA's National Institute for Food and Agriculture for a current project using Thrifty food plan style optimization models to understand cost nutrition trade-offs. Things like, how does the cost that we would estimate being needed for a healthy diet change depending on assumptions that we make about what is the protein source or what is the animal agriculture inputs. I'm going to just show, for example, the interesting thing about these Thrifty food plan optimization models is they don't just pay attention to cost and they don't just pay attention to nutrients, but they also pay attention to appeal. They think seriously about, if you just paid attention to costs and nutrients, you could sort of prescribe a fairly austere diet that would be very nutritious. And you could see that your estimate of how much cost would be needed would be low. But if you actually want people to like the diet or to consider it sort of adequate from a societal perspective, then we have to be talking about higher costs and having diets that are more close to people's own preferences. So if you have sort of distance from people's current preferences on the vertical axis, and you have different sets of criteria about what constraints do you need to meet, what is your definition of adequacy? As you move rightward in this figure, and this figure, by the way, is not from the new research. This figure is from a version of this that we did on the occasion of the last Thrifty Food Plan update in 2009, and my current project is updating figures like this. As you move rightward, if you just needed enough energy, or if you just needed enough energy and nutrients, the cost would be modest. But if you also want to meet what was at the time of this study the My Pyramid constraints, and currently in current US federal guidance would be the My Plate nutrition constraints, then you're talking about higher costs. And so you can see how the federal government ended up in August with this decision that a higher cost was needed in the Thrifty Food Plan. Talking on this, in the spirit of the theme of checking it out yourself, our research team was sort of intrigued by nutrition education materials from a nonprofit provider of nutrition education, Cooking Matters, and we imitated this ourselves with foods kind of in our own lives, thinking about what is the cost and what is the nutrients that we get from food, so that it's not just a mathematical modeling exercise, but can actually be connected to our own lives. So let me switch gears. You would think it's switching gears entirely, but it's not entirely switching gears, and talk about what is the opportunity for leadership for Tufts University using this food policy example, this animal agriculture policy example, merely as an illustration of the type of things that could be happening in different places across the university. And I feel a sense of institutional pride as I think about the pieces that we have in place. Dean Kite at the Fletcher School, the leading school of diplomacy at Tufts, is an internationally known expert in climate diplomacy. Things like how do country commitments get enforced that contribute to international coordination of climate targets. Julian Agerman in urban and environmental planning is a leader in thinking about just sustainability with a sense of fairness for all the people in our society. Eric Hines, an engineer, is a leading expert in offshore wind. And as you think about offshore wind, it's not just an engineering problem, it's a societal problem also. What is the sources of political opposition to siting of offshore wind that constrains it or prevents it from being a bigger possible part of the climate solution? I've been in conversation with the student activists at Tufts Climate Action, who traditionally had a focus on especially financial divestment, encouraging the trustees to divest from the fossil fuels industry. But in the past year, over a series of conversations, has been engaged in thinking more strategically from the university perspective about what bundle of initiatives at the university level could help the university establish leadership. Tufts has strengths in public citizenship because of the Tisch College, and the new dean of the Tisch College, Dana Cunningham, at MIT was responsible for financing initiatives, including on climate, figuring out how would innovation in this area be encouraged. And so I think she's going to be bringing that interest to her work at the Tisch College. My economist colleague, Gib Metcalf, is a leading expert on how fossil fuel pricing policy is related to climate action. And my colleague at the Friedman School, Aaron Coughlin-DePerez, is an IPCC lead author on the section of the second working group from the IPCC that was responsible for thinking through how is adaptation to a changing climate going to be fair to people, especially in low-income countries. So as you think about either rising seas or salination water supplies or drought or other consequences of the climate, how would that work overseas? Finally, the Office of Sustainability at Tufts does work on our campus as a living laboratory. So with the students from Tough Climate Action and with a conversation series over the course of about half a year, we sort of workshopped a set of principles for the university's consideration that included priorities for research, priorities for education, priorities for how the Tufts campuses could be used as a demonstration, as a living laboratory, sort of showing for larger economic sectors what the road forward would look like. For me personally, I think a distinctive feature for Tufts could be this spirit of fearless truth-telling about carbon accounts, because once you start to think quantitatively and with rigor about the carbon budgets, the implications and the lessons and the fruitful applications show up in every sector, from Dean Kite's international climate negotiations all the way to our Office of Sustainability's annual carbon report as part of its annual sustainability reporting. I think the divestment plank, this was partly because this is a group process. And so whether or not divestment was going to be my own priority, I feel like it's used as a symbolic, it has a symbolic role in signaling whether a university is serious about climate action. And finally, climate adaptation with a sense of justice. Having climate adaptation not be about walling off a privileged community from the larger world and sort of making sure our university community is okay. That's sort of one vision of adaptation. But instead thinking about adaptation as being open-bordered and engaged with the issues of justice in society at large. For me, one project, one example of a university that being serious about climate action with attention to the hard nuts and bolts of these budgets is we would have to talk even about our own biggest areas of emissions, including some that are sensitive. Whenever I talk about flying, I think people in university communities worry that this is going to be so austere, it's going to prevent us either from accomplishing the good that we want to do in the world or from enjoying our life as a thinking community. My own personal experience has been quite the opposite, that with substantially less flying, it's still possible to have a thriving academic career, to stay engaged with people internationally, and to have a lovely experience of travel life. We could talk at any length that people want to talk. On demand-side innovation, there's such opportunities here for university communities also to think about the way that we do things. I helped during the COVID times, during the pandemic, I helped an international conference series on agriculture, nutrition, and health, so sort of related to my own area of interest, that was led by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, transition under very urgent circumstances, their annual in-person conference to a remote conference in 2020. And their annual in-person conference was especially purposely located in lower and lower middle income countries every year just to ensure access for scholars from around the world. And so as you can see in this figure, in the year 2020, the greenhouse gas emissions for the aviation plummets to zero, and our interest in this article for Lancet Planetary Health was, what is the trade-off? As greenhouse gas emissions plummet, what is the sacrifice on the other side of the ledger, for example, for participation and ability of people around the world to engage? But the engagement went up. During the 2020 year, the number of participants in the conference was substantially higher than it had been in any prior year. So this is not to belittle the challenges. The article plainly discusses the limitations on social connection and on in-person, face-to-face engagement. But still, you have to think about what is the opportunity here. Not all the time, but at least a substantial amount of time to rethink how are we doing things in a way that we can be proud of in years to come. So you can see the themes that touch both the food policy part and the Tufts University part of this talk, including carbon accounting, price signals, innovation on the demand side as well as the supply side, the need for combining our research and scholarship with public citizenship, and a sense of trying it out ourselves, not to be some type of conservative 1,000 points of light, but rather with a sense of strategic vision for what are we going to inspire in larger economic sectors. Thanks so much for letting me come, and I look forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Parke. That was wonderful, very engaging. Parke, as you can see, is very enthusiastic about his subject matter, and we just love him for that particular and unique trait. Questions from the audience here live in...
How do you see new domestic policies like Prop 12 and other animal welfare issues affecting the economics and the supply chains?
So the question is, how do domestic policies such as Prop 12 and animal welfare affect these agriculture policies? And it was interesting because in some ways I was describing in the formal part of the talk the more traditional agriculture subsidy parts of this, but I wasn't talking as much about environmental policies that affect animal agriculture. One of the things that I find most appealing is if you think about animal agricultural policy, agricultural policy, as you think about what would be the potential benefits of having the price be higher, right? If the price were higher, people would consume less. You would have to think about how could this be done in a way that's fair? But doing it in a way that's fair brings to mind the importance of the social safety net and SNAP. So once you start to accept the idea, not that the government should be encouraging high meat prices, think about what a political dud that would be to have the government try to encourage higher meat prices, but rather to have the policy be not panicky about the consequences for higher meat prices. As soon as you adopt an attitude that we don't need to panic about moderately higher meat prices, it opens up the door for sensible environmental and animal welfare policies, each on their own methods, to have a little more political space. So if you think about what policies would cause concentrated animal feeding operations to have less risk of releasing waste into water supplies, or the animal welfare policy that you mentioned. Currently, there is a sense of panic about animal welfare policies that if we adopted those policies and we made our production systems less industrial, that the cost per unit would be higher and that would be intolerable. But I'm just not sure it would be intolerable. One of my favorite animal welfare policies, innovations, involved a conversation between the Humane Society of the United States and the United Egg Producers. So these are two organizations that you would think would always be at odds, but they reached an agreement on a compromise position about what types of production practices are sufficiently good for animal welfare to deserve a label that was favorable, and they agreed even on what would be the cage sizes for egg layers that were suitable, not for specially labeled production, but even just as the basic, not too cruel, for general industrial production. They reached these compromises, and it failed to pass Congress because of political opposition from the other industry groups, not the egg producers, but the other industry groups that felt like the precedent was dangerous. Imagine if you were a pork producers association thinking, if people are going to reach agreement on this and it's going to pass Congress on this, what's going to be the implications for gestation crates? And so I don't have a particular view on the animal welfare policy, except to say we can make animal welfare policy on its own merits. Really, the people in this room have the expertise needed for designing sensible policies, but feeling that you have a little more political elbow room than you might have thought.
More questions?
Not yet. I don't know if some people are driving or something. Maybe they can raise their hand or something if they have a question. I can unmute them.
I have a question, maybe keep things moving along. A little related, side related, I guess, to the main focus, but Russia-Ukraine war. What's the immediate and the sort of midterm impact to the goals that you have, and specifically to the food buyer here in the U.S.?
So it affects food prices in two ways. One is through the food sector, and the other is through the fuel sector. Traditionally, the fuel sector was closely, for decades, the fuel sector has closely been connected to food prices through a cost push mechanism. The idea is if fuel gets more expensive, and also wages have to go up to accommodate higher prices, then food prices also are going to be more expensive. In recent decades, the fuel sector and the food sector have been connected in a second way also, which is through the energy market. Because when fuel prices are higher, it's more economical to allocate more of our corn supply in the United States or more of the soybean supply in Brazil to the biofuels production rather than to food production. And so we are now, the fuel sector, things that cause a spike in fuel prices also cause a spike in food prices. Furthermore, Ukraine is one of the world's several breadbaskets for wheat, and I think for oil seeds. And so, there's also a more direct consequence. The international agricultural system can handle failures in one or another breadbasket fairly smoothly. The prices go up, people bring more product from other breadbaskets onto the international market. The thing that stresses people who are concerned about climate resilience is what happens if there's failures in several breadbaskets at once. So for example, if there's a particular percent risk of a failure, either environmental or war or production in one breadbasket, what is the chance of having it be 2 or 3 breadbaskets happen at the same time? Because that's what could throw the world into a more substantial crisis. Yes?
Question from online. You mentioned you could tell a story on pork, the other white meat. Could you tell a little of that story?
A little. So each of these checkoff programs, just to say a word more about the checkoff programs, is you will sometimes hear people say these are not federal government programs because the actual funding comes from the producers. So the way the checkoff program works is the federal government establishes a producer board and establishes a mandatory payment, and then the people in that industry make a mandatory payment. And so it's using the federal government's power of taxation, but it can be described within industry circles as more of an industry self-help organization. So in the case of the other white meat, the 2 key organizations that you need to know about are the National Pork Producers Council, which is a more traditional trade association, and the Pork Checkoff Program, which is the semi-public government board that collects these mandatory payments and promotes advertising using slogans like pork the other white meat. So with that particular slogan, there was a scheme to transfer $60 million from the well-funded government checkoff part of the operation to the private sector National Pork Producers Council in return for the intellectual property rights to pork the other white meat. And so when this happened a number of years ago, I started asking questions like, did you have some sort of appraisal? Like, you know, when you buy a house, there's an appraisal that says, what was the property worth? Do you have an appraisal showing why this slogan was worth $60 million? Because otherwise it looks a little suspicious. And they wouldn't share it with me. For a number of years, all I had was an expurgated, blacked out version, like it was national secrets. And in more recent years, they've had to release it under a Freedom of Information lawsuit from an animal welfare organization. And so you could see how it's a sort of not a widely known area of U.S. food policy, but you can see how I ended up intrigued, bordering on obsessed with demand expansion policies from the logic that you've heard in the conversation today.
So, Parke, thanks so much. We've thoroughly enjoyed it, and you will be staying for a little while here. If anyone from the audience or online wants to join Parke for further discussions around this whole field, please feel welcome. There's tons of food for those of you who are here. Parke, thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me.